Hello world. I was going to do a random LP review because somebody in the comments said it's time for you to do another random record review. And I was about to do that and I got Wal. Here's Wal. And he chose 3 albums for me. So off he went, and here's the first one he's chosen. The Supremes' A Go-Go. Now, I'm not going to review this today because I took it out of its sleeve and I had a look at it. And on the label, no one ever reads the small print of labels unless you're a record collector. And one of the things that you'd be looking at, especially Beatles nerds, is this text on here. And I can't really show you it. I'll give it a go. Can you see that? Sold in UK, subject to resale price conditions. See price lists. This came out in 1966, about the same time as Revolver. Now, I've been trying for quite a while to really find out a little bit more about that statement and what it means, just because it's such a precious one to Beatles collectors who want to get all the first original pressings in their collection. Because from about 1963, I think with the Beatles was the first time that this sold in the UK statement had been put on a Beatles album, and by 1969 it was taken off all of the Beatles albums. So I think it was basically any record that came from the EMI stable that had this statement on it. So I've seen them on classical records from HMV. I've seen them on Capitol records, because Capitol and EMI, everywhere else in the world, Australia had EMI Australia. South Africa had EMI South Africa. India had EMI India, and so it goes on. But in America, the American division of EMI was called Capitol, as in named after the Capitol buildings, as in OL at the end, as it were. And every record that was released by EMI in the United Kingdom had this sold in the UK thing. And I can't find anything really about what that actually means. I have a feeling because this was dropped in 1969, and that coincided with a time when the British government put an end to what's called price fixing. Now, price fixing basically meant that the manufacturers of goods, and remember there was no such thing as online, no such thing as downloads, everything was a physical thing that you had to go out to the shops and buy. So, for example, with records, I can remember in Clacton when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, there are at least 4 record shops in such a tiny little seaside town. If you went a bit further afield to Colchester, you would find that there would be Virgin, you would find Our Price, you'd find WH Smith's, you'd find Woolworths, you'd find any number of, there'd be an Andy's Records there as well, I think, and you would find any number of little small independent record stores as well that were all selling records, and that's the only place you could get them, actually, from a record store. All right, and in the 60s the record companies were actually trying to price fix the market. Now, EMI, whether or not this worked to their advantage or not, but EMI were the only ones who put a statement on their records to kind of imply that this was going on. At least I think that is what the sold in the UK is actually referring to. In other words, it was the record companies saying, or EMI was saying, if you want to sell this record in the United Kingdom, you can't sell it below a certain price. You can't sell it above a certain price. So that was their kind of margins. And it basically meant that the manufacturers of goods, because it wasn't just record companies and it wasn't just EMI, I'm sure, even though Pi Records or CBS or whatever, they all basically were doing the same thing. They just didn't shout about it. EMI were the only ones who shouted about it. It was the manufacturer who fixed the price, which meant very little competition in the high street, which is not particularly good for retailers, and it's not particularly good for the consumer. As I say, this practice ended in the United Kingdom in 1969, and I can remember wandering around Clacton as a teenager in the 1980s looking for the cheapest place I could buy my Duran Duran and Gary Newman and Tears for Fears albums, trying to find, who's going to give 50 pence off here or a pound off there, kind of thing. An album, a vinyl album or cassette in the 80s, basically for a chart vinyl album at any rate, cost between £4.49 and £5.99. Obviously, by that time, manufacturers, i.e. the record companies, wanted to get their new records flying up the charts, so they would offer more favourable deals to retailers to stock those records, in particular Woolworths. I can remember that even in the early noughties, when we were all glued to Pop Idol and we all wondered whether or not Will Young or Gareth Gates would win Pop Idol, and a week or two before the final, they both released the same single. Can't remember what the single was at all now, but I'm sure someone will remind me in the comments. Yeah, there was a penny difference between Gareth Gates and Will Young's single in Woolworths, with the hope that people would buy the cheaper one. And the cheaper one was obviously the one that Simon Cowell and Simon Fuller, that's it. But they were, really rooting for Gareth Gates to win this. And, they must have been really annoyed when Will Young won it. It must have really annoyed them. But, there was this penny difference. And that penny difference was decided by Woolworths. It wasn't decided by the record companies, even though the record companies had tried to put a little bit of pressure on, But in the 60s, when the record companies were making this decision, don't sell it above this price, don't sell it below that price, it just meant that there was no competition between record shops. I can remember watching on YouTube some 1967 footage of London, and there was just this tiny little clip of people browsing around Carnaby Street, and there was a little record shop, and it had singles there, 7 shillings each, 3 for £1, which basically meant you were getting a shilling off, the equivalent of 5p nowadays. But you wouldn't get that nowadays. That was how much records were. All singles were 7 shillings each in 1967. You couldn't wander round to Woolworths down the road or Magic Music up the high street and expect to get 5 or 10p off the single, because it just wouldn't happen. All right, and that meant that presumably if you were a record shop and EMI had wandered in and said, look, we've got this group, they're the next big thing, take 100 of these. And they'd take 100 of those, and nobody gave a toss about this new thing, the next big thing. Let's call that group called the next big thing. Nobody really, we couldn't sell them. So what happens to those records? Because you can't sell them below a certain price. You can't knock a third off them and stick them in a sale and say, right, well, just somebody buy them. That's what this sold in the UK meant, basically. It was an attempt to set prices by the record industry, and as I say, no other record companies put this thing on their record except EMI. And EMI, whether or not they were being honest and just saying we are setting records sold in the UK subject to resale prices, see price lists for details, whatever it says. I don't know. If anyone's got any more information about what that statement really means, I'd be very interested to know, to be honest. But I think I'm quite close. It is to do with price fixing. It is to do with the record company trying to have the upper hand. Now, here comes another thing, because a while ago I put a video up about the 2 Red and Blue albums. It was a question. Bear with me. about these albums here. But yeah, you had these two albums, and the question that I asked was, why are they on Apple, when particularly with this Red album here, all of these songs were released by Parlophone, which is a division of EMI. Most of the songs on this album were released by Parlophone, which is a division of EMI. It's just weird. So that was the question I put out. And people were saying, well, Apple and Parlophone were the same thing. And they weren't. They absolutely weren't, okay? It comes back to this album again. So there is a link, a tenuous link between these two albums, because this is Motown. This is a Motown record. It's even got Tamla Motown on the label. All right, there they are, Tamla Motown. However, on the back, it's also got EMI Records, the Gramophone Company Limited, Hayes, Middlesex, England. There. This is because Motown were not the same record company as EMI. They had just struck up a deal whereby EMI would distribute Motown's records in the UK, because EMI had huge factories that could press records, and you know, all of the networks there in terms of lorries to cart these records around the country, and you know, all of that sort of selling clout, as it were, that would make albums, Motown albums such as the Supremes, you know, hopefully sell like hotcakes. It was actually quite difficult in the 60s to get the UK to accept these Motown artists. It took a long while and a lot of effort before anyone had even heard of Diana Ross, for example, in the UK. This is the difference between those two fundamental relationships there. A similar thing happened in the 1980s, although to less spectacular results than Motown, when Gary Numan's last LP for Beggar's Banquet, which, you know, and probably his last really famous LP that sold anything like the quantities that was used to, was Warriors in 1983. Okay, and then his deal with Beggar's Banquet ended, and he decided that he was going to start up a new record company, run on totally different lines, a bit like the Beatles in the 1960s. Oh, Apple will be, you know, where artists can come and we'll work for the artists, and you know, I want to go and release an album that sounds like somebody in space, and we'll say go away and do it, kind of thing. And Gary Numan was trying to run his record company along, you know, far more liberal lines than he'd encountered in the corporate world of record companies of the 1980s. And so he released or started a label called Numa Records, Numa. And he got a few punters interested in signing up with him. One was an absolutely dire act that I saw as part of the Berserker tour called Larry Lober. Absolutely dire. But his idea was to try and promote these and give as much sort of promotional clout to these albums as he would to his own albums. All right, bearing in mind that his own albums are actually suffering at the time, it probably wasn't the best idea. But the point that I'm making here is that this Numa Records needed a bigger record company division-y sort of thing, as it were, to press those records and distribute them. All right. Now, in the 1950s, 60s, a label was born called Pye Records, Pye. All right. They're most famous for having Petula Clark on them, The Kinks, Donovan, artists like that. You know, really, you know, quite prominent artists. I think even Cat Stevens was on there at some point. Yes, I absolutely think he was with Pye. All right. By the 1980s, they changed their name to Precision Records and Tapes, and it was to them that Gary Numan went and said, "Look, I need someone to distribute my albums." All right, and this was the kind of deal, coming back to the two red and blue albums, this was the kind of deal that Apple had with EMI. All right, at that point in time, there were quite a lot of people that we associate with EMI Records that actually were kind of working freelance, in particular George Martin, for example. By 1965, he'd decided that he'd had enough of earning a weekly wage that was, quite middle class and all right and okay, but not really in the same ballpark as the Beatles were earning, even though he was producing their records. So he went to EMI and said, look, I'm going freelance. And he got together with a lot of other record producers and formed Associated Industrial Recordings, something like that. It's AIR, anyway, AIR. Right, there's just been a new documentary out. Watch it. It's called Under the Volcano, because he went out to Montserrat in the 70s and 80s, and a lot of really famous albums that we all know and love absolutely came from this thing. So you've got George Martin, who's not working as an employee for EMI anymore. They're going to have to give him a percentage of royalties instead. All right, you've got the Beatles, who are now not recording for EMI; they're recording for themselves, and EMI are doing all the legwork. And they're obviously, yes, of course, you can use Abbey Road Studios. It would be foolish of us to ever say no to that. All right, but that was the kind of deal they had, and that was the deal that went on until 1975. And if you look at any original pressings of solo Beatles recordings from 1970 to 75, you will see that you've got this Apple on there, but you've also got EMI records also somewhere in the small print, basically saying, well, look, we're the ones doing the distributing. All right, I'm sure that not all of those Beatles records, in fact, I know that, for example, Imagine, released on Apple, distributed by EMI, but recorded in John's own studio in his mansion that he had in, so was it near Ascot or somewhere like that? He had a huge mansion. There was his studio, and it was his studio. It wasn't EMI's, and it all suddenly comes to an end in 1975. All of the Beatles' own recordings and records and things were all held in limbo for a long time while people tried to sort out. There's a huge amount of financial spaghetti, as it were, that needed to be sorted out, and the judge basically said, look, let's freeze the whole lot of it. Okay, we'll sort it out, but it gets frozen at least until 1975, when this deal that Apple have with EMI has ended. So all of their records, all of the assets from their records got frozen, including their solo records. This bizarre arrangement, because it was between the Beatles and EMI, and the Beatles and Apple, it was a really bizarre thing. And I don't know why. I've read countless books about this, and I'm still none the wiser, really. But what happened was that if John Lennon made an album, a solo album, then Paul, George and Ringo also had to profit from that album, and it was the same with the other three. Hence, this is why we have got albums with John Lennon and Yoko Ono on them, and songs that are co-written by John and Yoko. Now, and the same with Paul and Linda. And now I'm not belittling the talent of these two ladies. I do question the exact amount that they put in. Okay, and it might well be, I think, like in Live and Let Die, for example, Linda McCartney came up with the words about you've got to give the other fella hell. Yeah, it's debatable, shall we say, exactly how much they put in. But putting Linda McCartney's name and saying, yeah, she wrote a bit on this one, meant that there would be a certain amount of money that came off these albums that would then go to Linda or to Yoko, and that would keep them going for a couple of years at least. It got sorted. But by the time that we look at 1975, 1976, where were the Beatles? George Harrison, he was still making records, but his last solo album with Apple / EMI, as it were, was a greatest hits compilation that had his own solo songs on one side and his songs with the Beatles on another side in an attempt to sell it. Because although George was very successful in his early solo career, by the mid-70s he was kind of washed up and they needed a Beatles thing to try and sell it. And because this contract was ending, EMI had a big say in it. Their stipulation was, when this contract ends, we can package the Beatles in whatever packaging we like and put whatever things on there and repackage them until the cows come home. And after 1975, you saw album Beatles love songs, Beatles ballads, Beatles rock and roll music, even the Magical Mystery Tour thing that was an EP in the UK had to wait until 1976, when a lot of this financial thing would have been sorted out before they could release it. So John Lennon had decided, he'd been through a huge amount of personal stress with his marriage to Yoko, which nearly fell apart, and then they got back together again. And by 1975-76, when he didn't have to do anything to do with Apple anymore, have anything to do with solo Beatles careers or anything like that, he basically went, "Woof, had enough. Here's a compilation LP called Shaved Fish. Now I'm going to go and bake bread, and my wife is going to have a child, and, I'm skedaddling for a few years at least." All right. Ringo's career was washed up anyway. Sorry to disrespect Ringo, but I don't really think, apart from one or two singles, I don't think that it was really any good. And Paul McCartney was in the middle of having a world tour and a great big resurgence with Wings, all right, but he was the only one who renewed this deal with EMI to distribute his MPL recordings, as it were. I think it's Music Played Loud. I think that's what that stands for. I don't really know exactly what that stands for. I've heard people saying that it stands for Music Played Loud. But yeah, he was still soldiering on, having kids with Linda, touring with Wings and whatever, and kept those ties with EMI. But the other three didn't. All right. Now, in the midst of this 1970 to 75 period, the guy who was in charge of Apple was a gentleman called Alan Klein. He was the one who, when Brian Epstein died in 1967, was really trying to, sort of get his fingers into the Beatles, trying to get even before Brian Epstein died. He was letting out little stories about, oh yeah, do you remember that merchandising deal that Brian Epstein did for you? It wasn't really very good. He gave away 90% of your takings. Yeah, which is true. Brian Epstein did. Paul McCartney was having none of it because he, by this time, was betrothed to a lady called Linda, whose father was, in accountancy and really knew the music industry inside out, and he felt that he trusted him more than he trusted Alan Klein. All right, but Alan Klein, in the end, managed to kind of at least represent the other three Beatles. He was annoyed by 1972 because there was this sort of growing industry of bootleggers, people who were producing LPs that were inferior in quality to the original LPs, being sold for less, and nobody making any kind of money. At least the only people making the money was the bootleggers. The money was not going to publishing companies and song and royalties and this, that and the next thing. No, none of that. Alan Klein was really not the person to get on the wrong side of. But what had come to prominence was a compilation, a bootleg compilation of a lot of Beatles singles that hadn't been on LPs, plus the favourites from some of the LPs as well, all sort of taking place on this same album. And he thought, right, well, this is obviously something that the fans want, so we'll put it out. So that's why it was Apple who put that out, okay? And all the songs that were EMI songs would be basically licensed to Apple, and so therefore everything went out on the Apple label, whether or not it had been released on Parlophone or Apple. And interestingly, rounding this video off and coming back to the price of these things again, I saw there's a website, I think it's the Beatles Bible or something like that, can't remember, I'll try and put a link in the description, but you see the Beatles on different formats, the Beatles on vinyl, the Beatles on cassette, the Beatles on 8-track cartridge, and there was a picture of the Red Album as released on an 8-track cartridge, but it said on there only £3.75. This was 1973, only £3.75. Now, nipping to the Bank of England inflation calculator thing, and just trying to work it out, you can only put whole pounds in, but I worked it out, and in 2020 that would have been about £49.95. You know, again, slightly interesting. And going back to the Supreme Zagogo, as released in 1966, along with Revolver, the price of an album, as price fixed, sold in the UK, subject to resale conditions, see price list for details, an album would have cost £1, 12 shillings and sixpence. That works out in decimal coinage as £1.62. And £1.62, again, work that out in the inflation calculator, and that's about £26 in UK money in 2020. And so actually, although there are obviously online formats and CDs and things that are an awful lot cheaper, the price of vinyl hasn't really changed a huge amount in all that time. For example, my copy of ABBA Voyage, that cost £26. That's basically that these things, they haven't actually changed in their pricing really at all, despite the sold in the UK and then the sold in the UK being removed. It's all been swings and roundabouts really. Okay, so that's been a little bit of a ramble, and again, I cannot really say for definite exactly what happened between the Beatles and their financial affairs or anything. Money burns a hole in my pocket. I have none, and money burns a hole in my pocket. And I can't really say for definite what this sold in the UK thing means. But I'd like to know. I'd like to, get a wee bit more of an understanding. As I say, I've read books that detail the financial details of the Beatles, and it's still as clear as mud. I do know that it became a very, very difficult thing to sort out. As I say, by 1970, the Beatles just wanted to get shot of the whole thing. But yeah, I will finish it there. Okay, hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you soon. I will do this random LP review in the next week or so. All right, so watch out for that. See you later.